April 25th, 1945, Torgau, Germany, Elbe River. Lieutenant Grigory Volkov accepted the glass bottle from the American soldier with uncertainty that bordered on suspicion. The bottle was made of glass, a material so scarce in Soviet Union that glass containers were returned for reuse rather than discarded. The bottle contained dark brown liquid that bubbled and fizzed in ways that seemed unnatural for any beverage Volkov had encountered during 28 years of life in Ukraine and 3 years of war that had taken him from Stalingrad to Berlin. The bottle was cold, impossibly cold, given that no ice was visible anywhere in the vicinity and the April afternoon temperature hovered around 15 degrees Celsius. The American soldier, young, well-fed, wearing uniform that looked new despite months of combat, was grinning and making drinking motions with his hand. The gesture was clear even without shared language. This liquid was meant to be consumed despite its strange appearance and unnatural properties. Volkov examined the bottle more carefully. The glass was embossed with strange flowing script in Latin letters that he couldn't read despite 3 years of mandatory English classes at military academy. The liquid inside continued bubbling with persistent effervescence that suggested chemical reaction rather than simple beverage. The temperature remained cold despite being held in his warm hand for several seconds. The bottle itself was more precisely manufactured than anything Soviet glass factories produced. Uniform thickness, perfect symmetry, molded lettering that was crisp and clear. He drank cautiously. First taste was shock that made him cough slightly. Sweet beyond anything in Soviet military rations or even in civilian food that he remembered from before the war. Carbonated with intensity that made his throat burn as if swallowing something caustic. Cold enough that his teeth ached from contact with the liquid. Flavored with something he couldn't identify. Not fruit, not tea, not kvass, not any familiar taste from his childhood in Ukraine or from 3 years eating military rations. The second taste was revelation. The sweetness that had seemed excessive on first contact became pleasant, not cloying, but satisfying in ways that made him want more. The carbonation that had burned became refreshing, cutting through the dust in his throat from weeks of combat in spring heat as German resistance collapsed. The cold that had shocked became welcome relief after drinking tepid water from canteens for months. The unfamiliar flavor became interesting rather than alien, complex, distinctive, memorable. By the third drink, Volkov understood something that would reshape his understanding of American civilization and Soviet deprivation in ways that 3 years of combat and countless propaganda lectures had never accomplished. This beverage, this Coca-Cola that the American soldier was offering so casually that he had an entire crate of bottles sitting on his jeep and was handing them out to every Soviet soldier who approached, represented abundance that exceeded anything Soviet propaganda had prepared him to comprehend. Think about that. A Soviet officer who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, who had survived 3 years of the most brutal warfare in human history, who had been taught since childhood that Soviet socialism represented humanity's highest achievement and that American capitalism produced poverty and exploitation, was being psychologically transformed by a soft drink that Americans considered so ordinary that they gave it away to strangers without thought. What Volkov didn't know as he finished the bottle and felt the sugar rush spreading through his body after months of minimal rations was that this moment was being repeated thousands of times along the Elbe River as Soviet and American forces met for the first time. That every Soviet soldier who tasted Coca-Cola was experiencing similar psychological disruption. The sudden visceral understanding that American abundance exceeded Soviet propaganda claims by margins so vast that ideology couldn't rationalize them away. That the taste of American consumer goods was accomplishing what no Western propaganda could achieve, demonstrating through direct sensory experience that capitalist prosperity exceeded socialist promises. What Volkov didn't know was that he would spend the rest of his life, another 42 years until his death in 1987, trying to obtain Coca-Cola again. That the memory of those few bottles he drank on April 25, 1945, would haunt him through decades of Soviet deprivation where such beverages simply didn't exist. That he would tell the story of tasting Coca-Cola to his children and grandchildren dozens of times as a way of explaining what the West possessed that the Soviet Union couldn't provide despite 7 decades of promises about building socialist abundance that would surpass capitalist wealth. What Volkov didn't know was that within hours of this encounter, Soviet political officers would begin filing reports expressing alarm about the psychological impact of American consumer goods on Soviet morale. That thousands of Soviet soldiers would attempt to bring Coca-Cola bottles back to Soviet Union as physical proof of American abundance. That Soviet military authorities would confiscate over 8,000 bottles from soldiers during May and June 1945. Confiscations documented in military records that expressed concern about bourgeois contamination, undermining Soviet soldiers' ideological commitment. What Volkov didn't know was that he himself would try to hide 3 bottles in his duffel bag and would have them confiscated by a political officer who would write notation in his service record questioning his political reliability. That the confiscation would create resentment that would last for decades, not because the bottles themselves were valuable, but because they represented proof of experience that Soviet authorities wanted to suppress. That he would understand even then that the confiscation revealed Soviet leadership's fear that American consumer goods demonstrated truths about capitalist prosperity that contradicted fundamental Soviet propaganda. What Volkov didn't know was that 44 years later, in 1989, he would stand in line for 3 hours at a Moscow store to purchase Coca-Cola when it finally became available in Soviet Union during glasnost. That his first taste in 44 years would bring tears to his eyes as memories of that April afternoon on the Elbe flooded back. That he would tell the young people in line who had never known the Soviet Union of Stalin and who couldn't understand what the beverage meant to his generation, that this drink had taught him in 1945 that everything Soviet propaganda claimed about American poverty had been a lie. The mathematics of soft drinks were being written in glass bottles along the Elbe River, and those mathematics were proving something that Soviet ideology denied was possible, that capitalist societies could produce abundance and pleasure that socialist systems couldn't match despite decades of promises about socialist superiority, creating workers' paradise exceeding anything capitalism could achieve. By the time Volkov handed the empty bottle back to the American soldier, who gestured that he should keep it as souvenir and added 2 more full bottles from his seemingly inexhaustible supply, he had learned more about American civilization than 3 years of Soviet propaganda lectures about American weakness, depravity, and poverty. He had tasted evidence that couldn't be denied or rationalized away through ideological explanations. The side that could afford to give away cold, sweet, carbonated beverages in individual glass bottles to Allied soldiers as casual gesture of friendship was the side that had won not just militarily, but civilizationally. The side that treated such items as disposable rather than precious was the side whose abundance exceeded anything Soviet system had achieved or would ever achieve. April 25th, 1945, 1600 hours. Private First Class Robert Mitchell from Cincinnati, Ohio, had been ordered to establish friendly contact with Soviet forces on the eastern bank of the Elbe River, carrying a case of Coca-Cola and simple instructions from his platoon sergeant to share it with the Russians, make friends, and avoid causing any international incidents. The encounter that followed was documented in Mitchell's after-action report filed 3 days later with his company commander. According to the report, Mitchell waded across the Elbe River holding the case of Coca-Cola above his head, while Soviet soldiers on the opposite bank watched with weapons ready, but not aimed. One Soviet officer, later identified as Lieutenant Grigory Volkov, challenged him in Russian. Mitchell responded by opening a bottle and drinking from it to demonstrate the beverage wasn't poisoned or dangerous. The report stated that Volkov accepted the bottle and drank cautiously, exhibiting visible surprise at the taste. Within minutes, according to Mitchell's account, other Soviet soldiers crowded around requesting bottles with enthusiasm that exceeded what Mitchell expected. One soldier drank an entire bottle in approximately 10 seconds, then immediately requested another. A Soviet sergeant examined an empty bottle with fascination that seemed excessive for simple container, according to the report. The sergeant spoke to Volkov in Russian. Mitchell couldn't understand the words, but interpreted from gestures that questions concerned whether Americans could obtain more bottles and whether the beverage was commonly available. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov arrived and was offered a bottle by Volkov. According to Mitchell's report, Petrov spoke halting English and asked whether America made the beverage. Mitchell confirmed that Coca-Cola was manufactured in America and was available in every store for 5 cents per bottle. Petrov translated this information to other Soviet soldiers, whose reactions suggested disbelief. Mitchell's report stated that he distributed 6 cases, 144 bottles, to Soviet soldiers at this meeting point during the afternoon of April 25, 1945. Each case was emptied within minutes, as Soviet soldiers who had tasted Coca-Cola once requested additional bottles, and Soviet soldiers who hadn't tasted it yet crowded around demanding their share. The report noted that Soviet soldiers' reactions to Coca-Cola exceeded normal interest in novel food items. Multiple soldiers asked through interpreters whether they could have additional bottles to send home to families. The eagerness suggested psychological significance beyond simple appreciation of taste. American military authorities monitoring the encounter noted similar patterns at other meeting points along the Elbe. Reports from multiple locations described Soviet soldiers exhibiting intense interest in Coca-Cola and requesting quantities exceeding what could be consumed immediately. Intelligence officers interpreted this behavior as evidence that Soviet soldiers were experiencing direct contact with American abundance that contradicted propaganda they had received about capitalist poverty. April 26, 1945. Meanwhile, at Soviet 58th Guards Division headquarters, 15 kilometers west of Torgau, Political Officer Major Leonid Kushnir compiled disturbing reports from commissars attached to units that had made contact with American forces. According to documents preserved in Russian State Military Archive, Kushnir's summary report stated that Soviet soldiers were displaying unhealthy fascination with American consumer goods, particularly Coca-Cola. Multiple commissars reported that soldiers were requesting additional bottles, attempting to trade valuable items for soft drinks, and making statements suggesting that American abundance exceeded what Soviet propaganda had prepared them to expect. One commissar's report quoted in Kushnir's summary stated that Soviet soldiers were discussing American beverages in ways suggesting psychological impact beyond normal interest in novel food items. Several soldiers had made statements comparing American supplies favorably to Soviet supplies in ways that suggested insufficient political education about differences between socialist and capitalist systems. Another commissar's report noted that political reliability concerns had arisen from contact with American forces. Soviet soldiers exposed to American consumer goods were beginning to question propaganda about American poverty and exploitation. Direct observation of American abundance was contradicting ideological education in ways that verbal correction couldn't adequately address. Kushnir's summary recommended that contact between Soviet and American forces be limited to official meetings rather than casual mixing that allowed ordinary soldiers to observe American supplies. The report further recommended that political education be intensified to explain American abundance as temporary war production rather than characteristic of capitalist peacetime economy. The summary expressed specific concern about Coca-Cola. According to Kushnir's analysis, the beverage made particular impression on Soviet soldiers because it demonstrated several aspects of American abundance simultaneously. The sweetness demonstrated agricultural surplus, allowing casual use of sugar. The carbonation demonstrated industrial sophistication in beverage production. The cold temperature demonstrated logistics capability, including refrigeration in field conditions. The glass bottle demonstrated manufacturing capacity, allowing disposable containers. The free distribution demonstrated wealth, allowing giving away valuable items without expecting compensation. Kushnir's assessment stated that each aspect contradicted different element of Soviet propaganda about American capitalism. The cumulative effect was psychologically disruptive in ways that required immediate attention through enhanced political education and limited contact with American forces. Meanwhile, at Coca-Cola bottling plant in Luxembourg, one of 64 military bottling plants established worldwide, production ran continuously to meet demand from American forces in Europe. Plant records showed daily output of 10,000 bottles using Coca-Cola syrup shipped from United States and local water filtered and treated to company standards. Plant manager Captain Thomas Henderson's operational reports documented that the Luxembourg facility had been built in January 1945, specifically to supply American troops advancing into Germany. The reports showed that production exceeded targets by approximately 4%, with quality control sampling demonstrating consistent flavor, carbonation, and temperature across all batches. Henderson's reports noted that logistics chain from Luxembourg plant to frontline positions delivered Coca-Cola within 48 hours of production, efficiency that exceeded many Soviet ammunition supply chains, according to comparative intelligence assessments compiled by American military analysts. April 28, 1945. The letter home. Lieutenant Grigory Volkov's letter to his wife, preserved in Russian State Military Archive after being intercepted by Soviet military censors, documented his attempt to describe what he had experienced during 3 days of contact with American forces. The letter, dated April 28, 1945, stated that Volkov had met American forces at Elbe River and that Americans had shared supplies, including beverage called Coca-Cola, that he couldn't adequately describe. According to the letter, the beverage was sweet beyond any candy he had eaten, carbonated like champagne, but not alcoholic, and cold as if stored in snow despite warm weather. The letter reported that Americans gave these drinks away freely without wanting payment or anything in return. Volkov wrote that he had asked through interpreter how much such drink cost in America. According to the letter, the American soldier stated price was 5 cents, and that every store in America sold Coca-Cola at that price. The soldier claimed that ordinary workers drank it regularly and that it was common rather than rare. Volkov's letter questioned what these facts meant about differences between Soviet and American systems. The letter stated that he had been taught Soviet workers lived better than American workers, but that American soldiers had supplies exceeding anything Soviet officers possessed. The letter expressed confusion about how Americans could afford to give away bottles of sweet cold drink that Soviet soldiers treasured as remarkable experience. The letter noted that Volkov had managed to keep 2 empty Coca-Cola bottles as souvenirs and was attempting to bring them home to show his wife what he had described. The letter stated that he wanted physical proof that such things existed, because otherwise she might think he was inventing stories or exaggerating what he experienced. Soviet military censor Junior Lieutenant Anna Mikhailova's notation on the letter, preserved in archive, stated that letter contained excessive praise of American consumer goods and suggested insufficient political consciousness on part of sender. The notation recommended that letter be delivered, but that sender be counseled by political officer about appropriate content for correspondence. The letter reached Volkov's wife in Kiev 2 weeks later, according to postal records. Her response, also preserved in archive, stated that she had difficulty believing her husband's descriptions because nothing he described resembled anything available in Soviet stores. She questioned whether he might be exaggerating because what he described seemed impossible. Volkov's subsequent letters, according to archive records, insisted that he wasn't exaggerating and that American abundance was exactly as extreme as he had described. One letter stated that seeing American supplies had made him understand that Soviet propaganda about American poverty was false and that American workers lived better than Soviet officials. This statement was flagged by censors as politically dangerous, according to notations in archive. Records show that Volkov was questioned by political officer and warned that comparing Soviet and American living standards in correspondence was inappropriate and could result in disciplinary action. He was required to write additional letter to his wife, clarifying that his previous statements had been misunderstood and that Soviet socialism was superior to American capitalism. Archive records indicate that similar letters from hundreds of Soviet soldiers who encountered American forces reached Soviet Union throughout May and June 1945. Each letter describing Coca-Cola and other American consumer goods contributed to spreading information that contradicted official statements regarding Western living standards despite censorship efforts. May 3, 1945. Soviet military orders dated May 2, 1945, and preserved in Russian State Military Archive, instructed all units that had contacted American forces to inspect soldiers' belongings and confiscate any American consumer products, including Coca-Cola bottles, cigarette packages, chocolate bars, and chewing gum. The orders stated that American products represented capitalist decadence and that Soviet soldiers should not be permitted to transport such items into Soviet Union, where they might create unhealthy desires among civilian population. Political officers were assigned to conduct inspections and document confiscations. According to records from 58th Guards Division, Political Officer Major Leonid Kushnir conducted inspections on May 3, 1945, as units prepared to withdraw from frontline positions. Inspection reports documented that approximately 200 Coca-Cola bottles were confiscated from Kushnir's unit alone, both empty bottles that soldiers wanted to keep as souvenirs and full bottles that soldiers had obtained through trades with American forces. Lieutenant Grigory Volkov's service record, preserved in archive, includes notation dated May 3, 1945, stating that 3 Coca-Cola bottles, 2 empty and 1 full, were confiscated from his duffel bag during inspection. The notation stated that Volkov protested confiscation, claiming bottles were gifts from American allies that he wished to keep as historical mementos. The notation recorded that Volkov's protest was noted as evidence of insufficient political consciousness. The service record shows that Volkov was required to attend mandatory political education session regarding proper attitude toward bourgeois material goods. The session, conducted May 5, 1945, was documented as covering ideological dangers of American consumer products and reinforcing that Soviet soldiers should not desire capitalist luxuries. Archive records indicate that thousands of Coca-Cola bottles were confiscated from Soviet forces during May and June 1945. Confiscation reports from multiple units documented similar patterns, soldiers attempting to keep bottles as souvenirs or proof of what they had experienced, political officers confiscating bottles as evidence of ideological weakness, notations in service records questioning soldiers' political reliability. One confiscation report from 34th Guards Rifle Corps, preserved in archive, stated explicitly that American consumer goods were creating ideological problems among Soviet forces that required immediate attention. The report estimated that approximately 8,000 Coca-Cola bottles had been confiscated from core units alone during a 2-week period in May 1945. The confiscated bottles were typically destroyed rather than returned to American authorities, according to disposal records. The destruction was documented as necessary to prevent American consumer goods from reaching Soviet civilians who might develop unrealistic expectations about availability of such products under socialist system. August 1945. Grigory Volkov returned to Kiev in August 1945, according to military demobilization records. His daughter's memoir, published in 1995, documented that Volkov told his family about tasting Coca-Cola during first evening home. According to the memoir, Volkov's wife and children had difficulty believing his descriptions because nothing he described resembled anything available in Soviet stores. The memoir stated that Volkov's attempts to explain American abundance were met with skepticism from family and neighbors who couldn't imagine drinks sweeter than any candy, carbonated like champagne, and cold, without visible ice. Volkov reportedly told family that trying to describe Coca-Cola was like trying to describe color to someone blind. The experience exceeded available vocabulary. According to the memoir, Volkov explained that he had attempted to bring Coca-Cola bottles home as proof, but that they had been confiscated by a political officer. The family was disappointed but not surprised, according to the account. Soviet authorities routinely confiscated foreign items and controlled what citizens could possess. The memoir documented that Volkov told extended family and friends about his experiences meeting American forces throughout following weeks. Every conversation eventually turned to Coca-Cola and other American consumer goods, according to the account. People asked consistent questions about sweetness, temperature, availability, and why Americans gave such items away freely. Volkov's account spread through community, according to the memoir. Each person who heard them repeated them to others. Word circulated that American prosperity exceeded Soviet propaganda claims, and that capitalism produced consumer goods that socialism couldn't match. The memoir stated that Soviet officer who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin had returned saying Americans lived better than Soviets, despite propaganda about socialist superiority. The memoir noted that political authorities called Volkov to meeting with NKGB officer who questioned him about statements regarding American abundance. Volkov was warned, according to the account, that spreading capitalist propaganda could result in serious consequences. He was instructed to stop discussing American consumer goods in ways that praised capitalism or criticized socialism. According to the memoir, Volkov stopped discussing these topics publicly, but continued telling family privately and answering questions from friends who wanted to know what he had experienced. He maintained that what he had witnessed was real and that Soviet propaganda about America was false. The memory of Coca-Cola never faded, according to the memoir. In 1950s, when his children asked about the war, he told them about fighting, but also about meeting Americans and tasting soft drink sweeter than anything they could imagine. In 1960s, when grandchildren visited, he told same stories. In 1970s, when Soviet dissidents began questioning system more openly, he told anyone who asked that he had seen American abundance firsthand, and it exceeded anything Soviet Union had achieved. June 1989. Grigory Volkov traveled to Moscow in June 1989 specifically to purchase Coca-Cola when he learned through news reports that it had become available in Soviet Union, according to his daughter's published memoir. The memoir documented that Volkov stood in line outside Moscow grocery store at 0700 hours on June 15, 1989. He was 72 years old, retired from military service, living in Kiev on military pension. His wife had protested that he was too old for such trip, according to the account. He had insisted that tasting Coca-Cola again was something he needed to do before he died. According to the memoir, approximately 200 people waited in line for store to open. Everyone knew that Coca-Cola shipment had arrived previous day and would be sold that morning. Store opened at 0900. Each customer was limited to 2 bottles. Price was 3 rubles per bottle, expensive by Soviet standards, but not impossibly expensive. Demand was so great that store sold entire shipment within 2 hours, according to the account. The memoir stated that Volkov paid 6 rubles and received 2 bottles of Coca-Cola. The bottles were identical to bottles he remembered from 1945, according to his description. Same distinctive shape, same embossed lettering, same glass quality. Volkov's reaction upon tasting Coca-Cola after 44 years was documented in the memoir. According to the account, first taste was overwhelming. The sweetness, carbonation, and flavor were exactly as he remembered, despite 44 years of memories that he had feared might be distorted or exaggerated. Everything was accurate according to his assessment. The taste matched his memory perfectly. The memoir stated that tears came to Volkov's eyes as he drank slowly. He wasn't crying from sadness, exactly according to the account, but from overwhelming sense of vindication mixed with regret. Vindication that his memories had been accurate. Coca-Cola really was as remarkable as he remembered. Regret that he had waited 44 years to taste it again, and that Soviet system had denied its citizens such simple pleasures for decades while claiming to build superior society. According to the memoir, Volkov told young woman in line that he was tasting something he had tasted 44 years ago when he met American soldiers at Elbe River. He stated that he had wanted to taste it again for his entire adult life, and that now he finally could. He explained that everything he had told his children and grandchildren about drink was true, and that they had sometimes thought he was exaggerating. Now he had proof that he wasn't according to the account. The memoir documented that Volkov kept both empty bottles from 1989 and showed them to children and grandchildren as proof that stories he had told for decades were true. He explained that these bottles represented victory of capitalism over socialism, demonstrated through something as simple as soft drink that Americans produced routinely and that Soviet Union couldn't produce at all. Volkov died in 1991, according to official records, just months before Soviet Union collapsed completely. His final year was marked by watching system he had served for 50 years disintegrate. The memoir stated that he wasn't surprised because he had known since 1945 that system was fundamentally flawed. The taste of Coca-Cola had taught him that, according to his statements to family. Everything since then had just been waiting for inevitable collapse that he had foreseen 46 years earlier on banks of Elbe River. The story of Soviet soldiers encountering Coca-Cola reveals fundamental truths about ideology, abundance, and the power of direct sensory experience that extend far beyond soft drinks and far beyond 1945. First truth: direct experience overcomes propaganda. Soviet soldiers had been taught since childhood that American capitalism produced poverty, exploitation, and misery. Then they tasted Coca-Cola and saw Americans casually giving away consumer goods that Soviet soldiers found remarkable. The direct sensory experience, taste, temperature, carbonation, contradicted propaganda in ways that no ideological argument could rationalize away. You could claim that photographs were faked or that statistics were manipulated, but you couldn't deny what you had tasted. Second truth: consumer goods communicate civilizational capacity more effectively than military equipment. Soviet soldiers could see American tanks and accept them as war production, temporary mobilization that didn't necessarily reflect peacetime prosperity. American soft drinks demonstrated peacetime abundance that revealed capitalism's fundamental superiority in producing consumer satisfaction. The fact that Americans could afford to produce such beverages in sufficient quantities to give them away to strangers proved that American prosperity was real rather than propaganda exaggeration. Third truth, generosity demonstrates strength more effectively than threats demonstrate power. Americans gave Coca-Cola away casually to allies who had been strangers and who came from a system that American propaganda portrayed as enemy. The generosity communicated abundance that exceeded Soviet comprehension. Soviet system hoarded resources because scarcity made everything valuable. American system gave resources away because abundance made individual items replaceable. The different attitudes towards same goods revealed fundamentally different economic realities and fundamentally different levels of civilization. Fourth truth, scarcity creates value hierarchies that abundance makes irrelevant. Soviet soldiers treasured Coca-Cola bottles as precious items worth hiding and attempting to smuggle home despite regulations. Americans discarded bottles casually because abundance made them replaceable rather than valuable. The different attitudes toward identical objects revealed economic systems operating on completely different scales. Soviet economy operated in framework where glass bottles were scarce and valuable. American economy operated in framework where glass bottles were abundant and disposable. The gap between frameworks was so vast that mutual comprehension was nearly impossible. Fifth truth, ideology cannot survive sustained contact with contradicting reality. Soviet propaganda about capitalist poverty was believed as long as Soviet citizens had no direct contact with capitalist prosperity. Once Soviet soldiers encountered American abundance directly, tasted it, touched it, witnessed Americans' casual attitude toward valuable items, propaganda lost credibility permanently. No amount of political education could convince someone that their own sensory experience was false. The taste of Coca-Cola was more persuasive than thousands of propaganda lectures because it was real in ways that ideology could never be. The Soviet soldiers who tasted Coca-Cola in April 1945 experienced something that Soviet ideology claimed was impossible: capitalist prosperity that exceeded socialist achievement despite decades of five-year plans claiming to build superior economy that would surpass capitalist nations and create abundance exceeding anything possible under exploitation of capitalism. They tasted that prosperity literally in form of sweet, cold, carbonated beverage that Americans considered so ordinary that they gave it away without expecting payment or even gratitude. The taste was revelation that couldn't be forgotten or rationalized away. The casualness of its distribution was proof that American abundance was real rather than temporary or exceptional. The memory of it lasted decades and undermined Soviet propaganda throughout the remainder of Soviet period. The bottles that Soviet soldiers tried to bring home were confiscated by political officers who understood that American consumer goods were ideologically dangerous. But the confiscations proved Soviet systems' weakness rather than strength. Strong systems don't fear glass bottles. Secure ideologies don't need to prevent citizens from possessing soft drinks. The very act of confiscating Coca-Cola bottles demonstrated that Soviet authorities knew their propaganda about capitalist poverty was false, and that direct contact with American abundance would reveal that falseness to Soviet citizens. The confiscations couldn't erase knowledge. Veterans who had tasted Coca-Cola knew that American abundance was real. They transmitted that knowledge to families through stories repeated for decades. They told children and grandchildren about sweet, cold, carbonated drink that Americans had given them when armies met at Elbe. They created skepticism about Soviet propaganda that contributed to gradual erosion of ideological certainty across generations. When Coca-Cola finally became available in Soviet Union in 1989 during glasnost, elderly veterans like Grigory Volkov could finally prove that their stories had been true. The bottles in stores validated memories that families had sometimes doubted. The taste that younger generations experienced for first time connected them to fathers' and grandfathers' experiences 44 years earlier at Elbe River. The beverages consumed on banks of Elbe in April 1945 were more than soft drinks. They were evidence that could be tasted rather than merely claimed. Evidence that capitalism produced abundance that socialism couldn't match despite 7 decades of promises. Evidence that American workers lived better than Soviet workers despite propaganda about capitalist exploitation. Evidence that Soviet system had failed to deliver prosperity it had promised, and that failure was fundamental rather than temporary. Soviet soldiers learned this through Coca-Cola. They learned it through direct sensory experience that couldn't be explained away by ideology or rationalized through political education. They learned it in ways that affected them for the rest of their lives and contributed to Soviet Union's eventual collapse 46 years later, when accumulated weight of reality finally overwhelmed ideology's capacity to deny it. All because American soldiers shared soft drinks with allies they were meeting for first time. Because abundance was so routine for Americans that giving away valuable items seemed natural gesture of friendship rather than significant sacrifice. Because capitalist prosperity had created consumer goods that communicated truths about relative capabilities of economic systems more effectively than any propaganda campaign could ever achieve. The Soviet soldiers who begged to take Coca-Cola home weren't begging for soft drinks. They were begging for proof. Proof that what they had experienced was real. Proof that American abundance exceeded Soviet deprivation by margins so vast that ideology couldn't bridge them. Proof that everything they had been taught about socialist superiority was wrong. They tasted defeat in form of sweet carbonated beverage served in standardized glass bottle that Americans discarded casually, but that Soviet soldiers treasured as precious evidence. Not military defeat, that war was won. Civilizational defeat, economic defeat, ideological defeat. The kind of defeat that couldn't be overcome through better tactics or improved training or increased political education. The kind of defeat that was already final when Soviet soldiers tasted Coca-Cola in April 1945 and realized that capitalism could produce consumer goods that socialism couldn't match after 70 years of trying. The kind of defeat that would take 46 more years to become obvious to everyone, but that was inevitable from the moment when Soviet authorities had to confiscate soft drink bottles to maintain ideological control. The bottles they tried to bring home would have proven it immediately. The confiscations delayed recognition but couldn't prevent it, and the knowledge eventually contributed to unraveling of entire system that had tried to keep its people from learning what Soviet soldiers discovered in April 1945 when they tasted American abundance for first time and understood that Soviet socialism had already lost civilizational competition with American capitalism. The sweet taste of defeat lasted longer than any military victory, and in end, Coca-Cola accomplished what armies couldn't, demonstrating through simple direct experience that one system produced abundance for ordinary citizens while other system produced deprivation, despite promises of building paradise. The Soviet soldiers who tasted Coca-Cola never forgot that lesson, and they made sure their children and grandchildren learned it too.